Good morning. I would just like to welcome everyone to our webinar on integrating ERM with other management functions. And as many of you know, this is a sneak peek around what is to come on April 19th when we launch the Smith School Risk Academy, which I will dive into a little bit more after I introduce our panelists. But super excited to have two very special guests with us this morning. The first is Carrie Anderson, who is a senior advisor for strategic initiatives within the FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Office of the Executive Director. And she is also the agency's performance improvement officer. Carrie has been with FERC for approximately 17 years and is responsible for ERM strategic planning, performance management, internal controls, not related to financial reporting, and several other priority initiatives. And then we also have John Basso with us this morning, and he is with Deloitte. He has 30 years of federal risk management experience. He is the former chief risk officer for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, where he directed VA's strategic planning, ERM performance management, governance, business architecture, and portfolio analysis. He's also a founding member of OMB's ERM Executive Steering Committee. So, wanted to just take a moment to introduce both of these panelists because, we really have, a great lineup with them both having had responsibility over both ERM and several other management functions that we will talk about today. So will be really good to hear their insights on all of those things. So want to just pivot over, and as I mentioned, this is a sneak preview around what is to come with our launch of the the Maryland Smith School Risk Academy. And just a little bit about that program. Again, it is launching on April 19th, and it is a collaboration between the University of Maryland and Deloitte to strengthen and sharpen risk professional skills as we continue to promote the use and advancement of ERM principles in the government and also commercial spaces. So we encourage you to please scan the QR code on the bottom of the slide, which will take you to the program website if you're interested in learning more about this program. As I mentioned, it's launching on April 19th with each module taking place on Tuesdays from 2 to 4. So a couple hours of each of your Tuesdays if you're interested. And it will comprise of 6 modules relating to building effective and sustainable risk programs. It also includes a 7th module on climate change and financial risk management. All of the modules will be facilitated by Dr. Cliff Rossi, who's here with us today, and also a Deloitte practitioner and an experienced industry expert. So again, it is a great opportunity to learn and grow with like-minded individuals in the broader federal risk management space. Couple other things to mention is there's an early bird discount. So UMD is hosting a free informational session tomorrow about the program from 12 to 1. And we do encourage you to sign up if you want to learn more about the opportunity. The last chance for the early bird discount is coming quickly, March 27th. So just a few days from now. And again, more details can be found on the website, which is again linked to the QR code. So I think from here, I'm going to hand it over to Cliff to get us started. Cliff, over to you.
All right. Thanks, Cynthia, for that introduction. And again, welcome everyone to our Risk Academy webinar today. As we were thinking about this one, it occurred to me that one of the things that comes about is having an ERM function within your organization, whether you are a federal agency or you're in a commercial enterprise that's not integrated into core management functions such as strategy or planning and budget making, for example, means that you've pretty much taken half measures, I would say, toward building a risk-centric organization and culture. And what we want to do today and the time that we have here is to dive into what it takes to achieve this integration. And we are fortunate actually to have 2 experts, as Cynthia just went over with us, to provide their experience and insights. So I'd like to, before we actually jump into the questions, I'd actually like to ask the audience to hold their questions until the end, at which point I will pick them up as we go along. If you'd like to put them into the chat, I will then ask our panelists today to weigh in on those things. So With that, Carrie and John, the impetus for risk management within the federal government, at least, comes to us from OMB Circular A123, the ERM Section 2. Don't want to get too technical about these things, as well as A11, relating to management responsibilities over internal controls and budget making, just to kind of set that stage. So maybe I'll start off with you, John, and kind of why don't you tell us a little bit about why should agencies really be looking to integrate ERM with other management functions?
Cliff, I think you actually teed this up quite successfully. It was 2016 when A123 came out. Obviously, A11 predates it. The ERM sections have been added over time. And since that time, we've seen agencies be really successful at starting to put in place ERM programs, many of them. They've built the foundation. And so I think the real question that senior leaders are asking of ERM programs is, how do you provide me value? And the way ERM programs provide value is they take this really rich risk information that we're seeing come out of risk identification and analysis, our partnerships with controls, et cetera, package it together and push it out in analyzed, tailored form to other management functions to help inform strategy setting, to help inform using risk and performance to manage to strategic outcomes, to help programs make risk-based decisions, to help inform budgeting. All of this is to suggest that risk management can really drive value in the other key management functions and at the program level if we move from simply being a pull body that pulls risk information through risk registers and instead transition to one that both pulls information, analyzes it and packages it and pushes really rich information down to decision makers tailored in a way where they can use it to set strategy, to manage to success, etc. So we're at that turning point. For those folks who are still standing up programs, the same story holds true. As you stand up programs, you will see rich information come in that you can analyze, package, and push so that people continuously see value from risk-based decision-making, building a risk culture, and those sort of key elements.
So Carrie, how does that fit in with what you've seen over at FERC?
I think, John, you did a very good job of just putting all of that together. You took some of my responses. But I think how I've seen it within the agencies, when it did come out in 2016, we were asking ourselves, okay, how is this going to fit into our organization? Really, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to implementing ERM within your management functions. I think to achieve maximum or optimal use and seeing that value across the agency is really, okay, how are we going to tailor that to our agency? What is our culture? How is our organization structured? And really looking at how do we gain those efficiencies and effectiveness of ERM, but also letting our stakeholders see the value that ERM can provide. Just specifically that risk-based decision-making, I think it just helps the agency focus, and it strengthens our decision-making process by informing the development of all of our goals and objectives across the program offices. But I think it really just comes down to how are we going to achieve maximum efficiency and effectiveness of ERM throughout our management functions within the agency.
Well, I'll throw that back to you, Carrie. That's interesting. And one question that I have for you and actually for John as well, given his experience at VA, was that hard to kind of, bring people along, bring senior management along to kind of buy in, if you will, to the whole premise of ERM? I know we've got the OMB circular out there, and sometimes, that brings people along, but just in terms of kind of like the mindset and the interest to become a risk-centric organization, what did you find there?
I think you made a good point asking, what does the agency look like? Working in a small agency, it gives us a lot of benefits, having that direct line to the senior leaders of the organization. Working in the office of the executive director, because we are responsible for all of the mission support functions of the agency, from HR to IT, security, financial, budgeting, acquisitions. having that direct line to our chairman, we were very successful in rolling out our strategy for our ERM implementation. Buy-in it wasn't automatic. We did have to educate, communicate what our approach was, the benefits of it, and also making sure that we are in compliance. But I think having that direct line to our chairman and being able to have the efficiencies of working within a small agency, not having the bureaucratic processes that you normally would have to go through in a larger or medium-sized agency. So we were very fortunate, and it took us some time just getting the plan together, developing that approach, and then communicating that across the commission to get that buy-in. And they saw it, and it was immediate. So we have been very successful with implementing ERM.
John, how about you see it both from your own experience, but a bit more across other agencies. What's been your experience on that question?
Well, I think Carrie did a fabulous job talking about small agencies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about larger agencies. That said, I think the broad principles remain the same. As you're standing up a program and trying to maintain its value and relevance, at least 2 or 3 things come to mind. Number one, OMB did a fabulous job opening the door for us to be able to put in place an important management function. And A123 and A11 give us sort of that open door, open window to step through it. But if they were sitting here talking to you, they would say that just compliance with A123 or A11 isn't enough. I mean, it's something we want to do, but that's not really what they were pushing for. They were helping us get an important management function in place. So how do you get it in place? You do need, it helps to have that top-down senior leader sponsorship. And the reason it helps so much is because agency leaders are really busy. Program leaders are very busy. Risk professionals often wear multiple hats. And so if it's not important to the boss, to be honest, then it may not be important to everyone. So if the boss makes it important, that certainly helps a great deal. How do you then get that buy-in from senior leaders and from other program leaders? Because delivering mission is still what matters. You need to get their involvement. Well, the way you do it is you provide them useful information. You make it helpful for them. At a large agency, that sometimes means knitting together silos that have been built over time so that people can see help from a bunch of different functions. So it turns out when you're trying to manage an important risk, you often need other program offices or other mission-facing folks to partner with because you have a disconnected solution. You also need HR, IT, acquisition, and others along supporting a risk response that has been brought in from senior leaders. And you need a governance system that provides oversight and accountability on the whole kind of, the whole package that gets you to moving from risk identification to risk management. And so it's that risk management that matters to senior leaders. And so getting that top-down buy-in by providing value and kind of knitting together a big departments, all their different silos into a complete solution can make a big difference to leaders.
Yeah, and you said something early on there too that certainly struck me in that comment about what the purpose of these organizations are, these ERM functions are, that it shouldn't just be, right, that they are you go through the motions of standing them up and then they said, yeah, we checked the box on that, we met everything with regard to the circular. It's more about making it a living, breathing organization that has value add to the entire agency. And that's the tough part. So that's that question about culture and kind of bringing that awareness to the entire organization. I want to ask you a follow-up question here, John, though, on providing some examples of where best practices, getting down to the brass tacks of this, of integrating ERM with management functions are happening today in organizations that you're working with.
Yeah, Cliff, I know we're going to talk quite a bit more about some of the different management functions that we integrate with. So I'll just kind of broadly say a few things. Number one, we are seeing, best practice that senior leaders really care about is prioritization. They are exceptionally busy people. Organizations have so much on their plate. And so a meaningful advantage that we can provide to folks is to help them, to leaders, is to help them prioritize what's most important in a proactive way. Organizations still are struggling with spending you can put whatever percentage you want here, I'll say 75% of their time putting out fires that have already started. Some would suggest it's issue management, but of course it's still risk management because of the reputational risks associated with not solving things. Nonetheless, they're putting out fires. What we're trying to do, of course, is both help them prioritize and put in kind of the fire breaks, to extend the analogy, that are proactive, that help prevent major problems from cropping up. So where do we see this happening? I mean, we're seeing it across the federal government. I can think of a large health agency that's been very effective at doing scenario-based contingency planning around risks, where they take their critical risks and they work with senior leaders to build scenarios that could occur in the future, to think through the risks that come up there, and to understand what contingency plans they need to put in place to manage those risks, what the key indicators are, and to think through, okay, so what help am I going to need if this were to ever be borne out as a risk? So you see that kind of risk-based thinking using a particular tool. I can think of other large federal agencies in the civilian sector that have really tied the use of risk appetite to their understanding of the strategic plan, so that they're thinking through how their strategies bring risks down to an acceptable level. I can think of another bureau inside of a large department that's been very effective at tying risk management to their budgeting process. They go in front of Congress and talk about how, after, in front of OMB and Congress, and suggest, hey, if this risk, if with this budget package you've given me, here's essentially what you're buying off on. Here's the risk assessment of what this dollars will get you. Here's what it's going to do to your citizens. If we're all okay with that, we're okay with it. And typically they are not okay with it. And then we're seeing other large agencies really start thinking about how cybersecurity is a critical risk, and how you can package that information to help understand its impact across all your critical IT systems, and more importantly, mission outcomes. So we're seeing a lot of really interesting best practices on integrating together risk functions and integrating risk with other management functions.
It's fascinating. And so Carrie, what does the risk governance process look like over at FERC, or in terms of integrating ERM with management decisions? I know you've got a role there that sort of where some of this already is woven together. So could you speak a little bit to your experience on that?
Sure. Working at FERC, I think I'm in a unique position where you may not find at other federal agencies. Sitting in the executive director's office, we manage all of our human capital planning, the CFO process, functions and responsibilities, our chief security office roles, responsibilities, and also looking at our IT. So we have multiple layers, just being that mission support function within the agency. So we had to take a step back and ask ourselves, okay, what is going to be a good fit for our agency based on our organizational structure, looking at the governance design and process. We really had to take a step back and take into consideration, okay, we need to make sure that we will have a continuous and focused support from the top of the organization, because it's not just within OED, it is across our programmatic areas as well. Looking at the communication flow of information that's needed for the effective decision-making within the agency. What's going to be the visibility of our governance structure? How are the decision-making authority over our agency's priority risk determined, as well as our internal control assessments, and how do we manage those processes? The one thing we did take a look at is making sure we had the right people sitting at the table to make those decisions. So we took a look to make sure the flow of information, making sure that information is flowing in the right direction, and looking at those decision-making capabilities. And also making sure that we scope our management functions into our governance charter. So what we did at FERC, we explicitly chartered our Senior Management Council, which rests within the Office of the Executive Director, and we have oversight of ERM and internal control. So from there, we also stood up a Risk Management Council, which gives additional visibility and decision-making priority decision-making power over those priorities that affect our goals and objectives of the agency. And we're just making sure that process is seamless. There's a flow of information, and it's being communicated in a timely manner, and that is elevated to the right individuals at the right time. And again, I think the ERM governance structure is going to vary between agencies. It just depends on what decisions needed to be made at what level. So we had a very successful program developing our governance structure, getting that communication out across the agency, making sure individuals understood what that process was going to be, and it's also an education process as well too, so people can understand what does this really mean for the agency.
That's interesting. How often, I'm just curious, how often does that risk council meet, Carrie?
For our senior management council, that's with the executives within OED. We meet on a quarterly basis. So the process that we've been going through over the course of the last year, being in this pandemic environment, it showed what the value of having that ERM capability meant. That means we took a look at reconstitution from all phases of it to see how is that going to impact our agency being able to successfully and safely bring individuals back into our building. So we actually took on reconstitution as one of our prioritized risks, and we started making decisions surrounding that process, and we took that to the Senior Management Council. But before we got to that point, we also had discussions with those directorates that had major responsibilities. Okay, let's identify our risk. What is our risk tolerance? What is our risk appetite going to look like? Okay, let's get these risks documented so that we're looking at it from all levels of the organization, not just from a support function, but how is this going to impact our staff? And we look at our staff as those are the assets of the agency. So we want to do everything we can to protect them. So we took that reconstitution as one of our risks, and we started working with our Senior Management Council, and it has been very successful thus far. So we're very pleased with the process.
Very interesting. It reminds me that we used to say everybody's job is risk management, whether you're at the staff level or all the way to the top, right? I mean, that's keep your eye open for these things. So it's
absolutely
interesting, right? Yeah. Hey, John, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are about what the key pillars. What are the key pillars that agency risk officials need to really be focused on when standing up an ERM program? Have some thoughts about that?
Sure, yeah, happy to share a few that we've seen kind of consistently throughout government make a meaningful impact in standing up a program. First, of course, is you do need a governance system. In many ways, Carrie just did a fabulous job talking about how their governance system both manages overall enterprise risk exposure and zeroes in on key risks to help make decisions that actually move the agency forward. And so it's not just a body that's getting briefings, and hearing information. It's a body that's actually acting on the key risks. So that governance system is sort of the ties that bind. It's the gears in many ways that move the rest of the risk management system because it's driving decisions and so on and so forth. Number two is you need effective risk management cycle, right? Somehow or another, the information that you're using to make decisions has to be identified and assessed and prioritized, and response plans have to be put in place, and there needs to be some kind of monitoring and reporting and communications component. So it has to be that risk management cycle. It doesn't have to be, this Taj Mahal of processes, but it needs to be something that's getting risk information from at least two levels. It needs to be getting risk information, kind of the bottom up feed, because a lot of time our senior leaders are a little bit blind to everything that's happening through no fault of their own. And by happening, I mean kind of in the field, at program levels, mission, within human capital, et cetera. So it's got to be the bottom up feed. And of course, there has to be the top down feed. Senior leaders have a strategic view of what's happening in the organization. And part of ERM's value proposition is to help manage manage to strategic objectives, so that, that governance system has to connect to a risk management cycle, and you have to have those layers of information and analysis coming in. somehow or another, to get that bottom-up feed successful and to get folks to participate, you have to have some kind of training, right? So you have to have some processes and some training. This is a natural language to a couple of organizations, financial regulators, and others. But for many organizations, this is not a natural language. And so we have to figure out a way to train folks in a manner where they can really effectively interact, and they want to interact with the risk management program. Associated with that, there has to be some kind of communications and change management pillar, right? Because if the tree keeps falling and no one's in the forest to hear it fall, no one really knows. You need to both have quick wins and communicate them and let folks understand how when you report risk information, the team, because risk management's a team sport, is acting on it and providing value so people keep reporting. So that change management and communications pieces is really important for the organization. That what you're communicating is value. So you do need, as a pillar, this constant thought process of how am I providing value to the organization? How am I not just being compliant? How am I actually getting value in terms of managing the top risk, making key decisions, et cetera? And then that leads to the last pillar, which is, okay, put those together and you have a risk culture where people are in their everyday kind of DNA and actions thinking about risk regularly, and it's informing how the organization does business.
Interesting. Those are great observations. I want to come back to a couple of things on those for both of you. One of the questions that I get oftentimes, I spent most of my industry career over in financial services, although I do have some experience on the federal space myself, but largely it was in risk management at banks and GSEs and things like that. And I remember getting a lot of questions about the difference in the role between ERM and audit. So on the financial services side, we have this 3 lines of defense doctrine, really kind of more spelled out with regard to the business line. The enterprise risk management function is the second line, and then internal audit as your third line. But in the context of how you think about that, could you talk a little bit about where you see the lines kind of distinguish themselves between the audit function and the ERM function, just to kind of lay that out?
Do you want me to take that one first, Terry?
Yeah, John. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah,
okay,
John.
Sure. Yeah. So government's an interesting body. There's not many parts of government that have an internal audit capability outside of the inspectors general. And so given that, so some do, and it can be a very fruitful tool for management, obviously. But given that, what we tend to see is that enterprise risk management programs are identifying and working with their broad stakeholders to prioritize the top risks and starting to respond to them. And that effectively done, the way you prioritize is you consider things like risk appetite and risk tolerance. So it's not just that it's a bigger risk, it's that it's a bigger risk outside of our tolerance or appetite. And so as we work with the auditing community in government, and here I mean the inspectors general, it's a meaningful and important point to have that discussion with auditors so that auditors understand management's view of what the top risks are and why they're acting on these particular risks. Another component of that is potentially sharing with auditors some of the areas where there are top risks and coming to an understanding of, so the IGs have to maintain independence, but coming to an understanding of sort of what are some elements of what an auditing plan may look like, or what are some inputs that could help shape their auditing plan, because management does want eyes on some of the areas that need a deeper dive and really need to assess what's going potentially wrong or a little bit off track and where we could see additional progress made. So in government, I think this relationship is a little bit fraught. You probably have heard it in the way I've been framing this, but it is potentially a very productive relationship because that third line of defense is one that can be of real value to the leadership and management team.
Okay, very good. Now I get that a little bit more clearly there. Hey, Carrie, can you walk us through a little bit about how the ERM framework at FERC relates to your agency's planning, strategic planning and performance management process?
Sure. So for the way our framework relates to our agency strategic planning, again, I'm in a unique position as a senior advisor for our strategic initiatives. We also have a group called strategy and risk management and performance. We actually do the strategic planning and manage that performance management process within the agency. So right now, as everyone is within the federal government, they're undergoing revising or refreshing their 4-year strategic plan and developing performance goals and setting priorities for your agency. So it's providing us an opportunity now to really take a look at our strategic plan and also how are we going to integrate ERM with that process. So what we did, we actually launched a risk assessment as relates to the strategic goals of the agency. We rolled that out to the program office directors, really taking a step back and looking at, okay, what are our strategic goals and what are the major risks that we foresee over the next 4 years that could severely impact us achieving our mission. Looking at their goals and objectives, we also made sure that people understood, okay, what are the major risk categories? We had to communicate what is our risk tolerance, and from there, based on the results from our risk assessment, we developed a risk profile. A lot of those things came to light to let the directors know, okay, these are the risks that we're looking at. Some of these risks may fall off later on down the road, but we need to make sure that we keep our eyes on it. And it made the enterprise risk management process, it brought to light what that value is to strategic planning and that performance management process. Once we did our risk assessment, we were able to successfully develop what our performance goals were going to look like and how we achieve those, and making sure all of those are in alignment from our strategic objectives, looking at our performance goals and those metrics, and what risks are going to prevent us to achieve those for the agency. So that's how we kind of integrated our framework, our ERM framework within FERC, making sure, okay, let's take a risk-based approach to one, how we set our objectives, and also how we are defining our performance process to make sure we're capturing the right metrics and making sure that we are developing risk responses to those particular risks as it relates to achieving those goals.
That's very interesting. So Carrie, help me out here. So when you're going through that process, every agency is going to have a different set of risks, right? That they have to kind of focus on, and you may have quite a lot of risks, and some of them are going to be primary, secondary, tertiary. How do you go about figuring out which are the ones that your organization really needs to focus on at the top of the house the most? What does that process look like?
What we did, we were able to, again, being able to get the right people to make those decisions and evaluation to making sure we're looking at it from the correct perspective. So what we had initially done back in 2017, we actually went through a risk assessment process, and we identified we looked at the threats and opportunities, and we were able to pull out a number of risks that would impact the agency. What we did from those risks, we developed a tiering process. We tiered those risks, tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3, making tier 1 our most priority risk that we need to assess, and making sure that we're developing the correct risk response as it relates to those specific risks. So 2017 roll around, we went through that process, and what we did last year, we did another risk assessment, taking into consideration the previous risk assessment that we did, looking at our current objectives, looking at the strategies that we're undertaking right now. And then we also took into consideration, let's look at our annual performance plans, looking at GAO reports that we've gotten back over the last 2 years. So we took all of that information, and from there we were able to identify additional risk. And then we broke that down by office, who's responsible for making sure or mitigating these risks for the agency. And it was just a very collaborative, a very cooperative process that we went through. And we were just able to continue moving forward with that, the risk assessment and developing the agency's risk profile.
There's a lot to it, right? And one of the things, and we probably can't get to too much of that today, or maybe another webinar, is how do you develop, when we're talking metrics and trying to understand these, we like to have them forward looking, and we like to develop these KRIs, right? These key risk indicators. And that's an art into itself, as to how you take your own internal data and translate that into meaningful information. But we'll put that aside. John, I want to come back to you on something here related to the budget process. I mean, how should ERM really engage with officials in that very important budget development process and the associated decisions that get made from that?
Yeah, I'll say as an opening comment on this, this is as critical of a relationship as ERM programs and chief risk officers can have in the federal government. There is a lot of value in having a good partnership with the folks who allocate dollars. And you become more important, it becomes a meaningful thing. And budget folks do want to partner with the risk management folks. And here's why. When they're developing the budgeting process, certainly in federal government, they're doing, kind of first planning and programming. And as they're setting their budget plan out, year and a half, 2 years down, they want to start addressing some of the top risks that are either enduring or longer term risks because of the timing of that budget process. So they want that risk profile, that set of key risk information in order to help that. And they really need it both broadly across the agency and in particular programs. So here's where you get to kind of tailored, pushed risk information on the key programs that an agency has that can really inform how that money should be spent, so that it's being spent in a way that's sort of proactively heading off some of the top risk areas. So that's a first and critical piece. As they're going through building that budget, they will put in the budget, and then they'll get back, as we talked about before, kind of the pass back piece. There should probably be a risk analysis of that pass back, because it helps the budget team be on stronger legs when it's talking to OMB and Congress on, okay, and I mentioned earlier, you cut us this, here's the risk ramifications of it. Here's what happened. So here's another clear partnership area that can be really valuable and really meaningful. In both those processes, it helps to have a prioritization scheme that talks about how dollars are sort of providing a return on investment from a risk standpoint. So if you can do that, that can be really valuable. In addition, if when we're doing our risk response planning, if we can build in having budgeting cost people on that team to actually cost out what the risk response plan looks over time, we've made a major step forward in translating risk information into the language that one of our key stakeholders works in. And then I'll add two other quick ones. End of year is a big time in government. And in particular, we end up seeing an end of year, I'll use the term sweep of dollars that haven't been executed and are still available during that year. And we go into a U for unfunded requirement, unfunded request process. That process should have risk information as a component of it. Because ideally you're spending dollars on particular those short-term, soon to happen risks in a manner where that's kind of part of the prioritization or weighting scheme on what gets funded. That's valuable for the risk team, and it's very valuable for the budget team to include that. And then lastly, Carrie did a great job talking about kind of the governance system and decision-making. Part of the governance system and ties to both budget and performance is doing kind of a quarterly performance or a quarterly budget and performance review that includes budget execution data. When you pull in that budget execution data, you can help the agency understand some of the risks that may occur because we're slow on execution, or because this or that hasn't happened, we've gotten out of sequence, whatever it happens to be. So that that final piece of kind of budget execution, not just planning and programming and budgeting, but also execution, is a place where the risk team can have a strong relationship with the budget team. And ideally it gets baked into kind of a monthly or quarterly look at the agency's progress towards achieving strategic goals that involves the strategy team, the performance team, the budget team, the risk team, and obviously the program leaders.
Interesting. So Carrie, how would what John has just laid out there, how does that play into what your experience over at FERC is on that budget process?
John, you touched on the critical fact, budget execution. What supports the agency in order to achieve its mission is your annual budget request, or as otherwise known, our annual congressional justification. What we do at FERC, and again, working at a small agency, it gives us the benefit and also provides an opportunity for us to have those internal decision-making meetings. We bring the relevant individuals to the table to look at, okay, how well are we executing our budget? What we have within OED, we set up set key results. One of our key results, I'm not going to go into a long soliloquy about it. Basically, it's called PDQ, people, dollars, and quality. People, how well are we managing our staff? And we take an annual measure from our FEBs. Dollars, how well do we execute our budget? So dollars being one of our key components of our key results. On a weekly basis, we get budget execution reports to make sure that we are actually managing and monitoring how well we are executing on our appropriated dollars. We need to make sure we're managing them efficiently and effectively. What we did for this year, we're working with our budget office as part of our budget process. When we're developing it, we are working to incorporate a risk reduction as a budget request rationale, making part of that budget request. You have to provide a justification. Okay, is this mitigating a specific risk to the agency? If this budget is not approved, what risk does that pose to the agency if we're not granted that request? And within that, okay, if we're not approved for our budget, we need to be able to assess that risk and develop a responsive action plan through a formal process to make sure that we're able to adequately manage our budget if we come up with a shortfall or if we're cut within our budget. So our budget team, we are really a very close-knit shop. Again, those weekly budget execution reports, making sure we're monitoring it, and also making sure we have the right risk mitigation strategies in place for our budget. So that's something that we take very seriously for making sure that we're able to adequately monitor it and report out immediately if we foresee any issues in the upcoming future, especially when we go through a CR. You're held to the prior year's budget request levels, and you have to make sure that you're going to have requests that may go outside of that budget level, but you have to make sure that you're managing it in an effective and efficient way while not compromising the accomplishment of your mission.
That's very interesting. A quick question for both of you. Maybe I'll start with you, John. Just a slight pivot from where we've been here. What have you seen work in terms of elevating employee and management awareness, for that matter, to various risks in the organization? Because after all, right, it's also about making sure everybody's job is risk management. But in an organization that might not be as mature or as new to the agency, how do you kind of build people's situational risk awareness, if you will?
Yeah, it's a great question, Cliff. We have seen some very effective and aggressive communications plans. There's a lot of communications platforms out there, channels, if you will, whether they're, blog sites or internal kind of SharePoint sites or newsletters or whatever it happens to be. Championing risk management in those is a very important and effective way to do it. It's best done, we've seen, through stories of risks actually being managed, so that people hear the kind of, here's what led to this, here's the analysis that happened, here's the outcome that came from it. It lets everyone see how they can participate in the risk management program from the bottom up and how it leads to real benefit for citizens and for their agencies. So that kind of storytelling component is really critical. The other component that can be pretty critical is focusing on some risk areas that matter to political leadership. And so that's just part of the government. We have both political and career leaders and career staff. And so we want the ERM program to be important to them, sometimes that means going to them, not making them come to us. So what's of importance to them? ESG risks are of increasing importance, particularly in this administration, and for excellent reasons. So if we can tell stories about how we're managing those risks and using enterprise risk management to help with that, we can help political leaders see their goals being borne out and how risk management is a key element in that. And that can also be an effective way. So the stories, effective way to like get people involved, and the targeted stories, an effective way to connect with the senior leadership team with whom you want to work closely to help manage the most significant risks in an agency.
That's risk use cases or risk vignettes, if you will, right? I mean, nothing brings it home, right, unless you kind of see something tangible that's been done somewhere else. I like that idea a lot, and I think not to make a shameless plug for our Risk Academy training, but I think one of the things that we focus on is all things applied risk management, real examples in our case. So I think that certainly resonates with me. Carrie, what about you? How about on the FERC side in terms of getting your people sort of pumped up about risk management and kind of looking out for those things, or what's coming around the corner?
I think what really worked for us was communication, education, and change management with enterprise risk management, looking at it from all levels, starting with the C-suite on down to the lower level staff. And again, each agency has its own maturity level. I know when we start talking about strategic planning, a lot of that sometimes may go over the lower level staff's head if you don't directly align their job, roles, function to the strategic plan to show them how they fit within that agency. Once they understand that they're part, because everyone wants to feel a part of something. Sometimes throughout the organization, they may feel, well, my work really doesn't matter. It may not have that much of an impact. At the end of the day, in their aggregate, everyone's work matters, and risk management is everyone's responsibility. So what we did is really communicating, sharing, showing what the value of ERM, what it can do for each organization, how you can make risk management, that framework, a part of everyday management decision-making, even at the lower level. So I think what worked well for us is making sure that the voices of staff is heard. They understand what risks are, how it could impact their work, and what their role is. And getting everyone on board with that, I think it opened up eyes, and it let them see the value earned within the organization. So it was great just being able to talk with staff, talk with the managers, talk with the directors, making sure they are directly aligning their staff's work to the strategic plan of the organization. And then they can understand what some of those risks are.
Yeah, that's definitely very interesting. I want to, while I've got you here, Carrie, I want to ask you a question that we've got from the group here. It says, at FERC, were additional staff hired to stand up an ERM function, or were A123 staff duties transformed?
Within FERC, Office of the Director, our strategy and risk management group is comprised of our internal audit team, and also for our performance and strategy team as well. We did not bring on additional staff. Again, within our budget, agencies are allocated specific FTE level, full-time equivalents. You have to manage your FTE levels. If you're not able to bring on additional resources at the employee level, we were able to contract that out to a very reliable, just highly specialized consulting team, Deloitte. They came in, and we were able to successfully stand up our ERM program. And we're still working through that process as well. So we are looking to either expand maybe a small portion of our staff, or bringing on an additional contract and able to support standing up our risk management program. So we have various venues and different resources that we can employ to make sure we have the ERM capability, making sure that it is appropriate for our agency size.
On that one, it's back to the at federal agencies, as it is in other organizations too. At times, there are folks that wear multiple hats, right? And I think that's another way that you kind of have to address that. John, I want to come back to something here on, we've seen a number of instances from industry where major risk events stem from organizations that just don't simply have a strong risk culture. Mea culpa, I was in several, unfortunately, over my career. How does that translate to federal agencies, and how can organizations kind of really cement that risk culture within there?
Risk culture takes real work. It's just people are so busy, and it's just not a language in most federal agencies, as I mentioned earlier, that immediately resonates. And so to get risk culture to really take hold, it needs to be easy. So taking part in the risk management process, it can't be an incredibly burdensome event, and so in short, the benefit better exceed the costs. If you want folks to participate and think from a risk-based culture standpoint. So we have to think about both levers, right? Make it easy for folks to participate, keep the cost low. And then that second part, make sure the benefit is high. For a lot of our staff, one way that risk management can be very helpful is it gives them a voice, to see to have their challenges moved up to be framed eventually as enterprise risks, if that's appropriate, when they're kind of aggregated and pulled together, and then they start seeing action take hold. That's the kind of thing that can build a real risk culture, no doubt about it. Additionally, we do see risk cultures start to really take hold at all levels when there is regular discussion of risks. So if this becomes just a once annual risk profile exercise that satisfies OMB, rather than a routine and regular way at each level of the organization to think and talk about risks, then it's difficult to build a risk culture. And then I'll just give one final kind of warning when it comes to risk culture. We've seen situations where agency staff or programs reported risks up, and then 180 degrees and they got their hand slapped by the IG, by someone else. That is obviously the opposite way to build a risk culture. People will not want to participate in risk processes. So you have to think about a way for it to be a real benefit to them where they sit, and a benefit to the organization writ large as you build this risk culture.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a surefire way of chilling the entire thing right from the start if you put that out there. Carrie, what's your experience on the culture side there from a risk management standpoint at FERC?
From my experience, when you talk about ERM, again, John, you touched on a hot topic. You don't want to make it burdensome, because as you say, the senior leaders of the organization, they were so busy, and the last thing they want to do, okay, risk, it's just a check the box exercise. Hey, let's do that later. I have to focus on putting this fire out or prioritize this particular issue at the time. What we had to do is really make people understand the value of risk planning, risk management. Risk management should not come at the end of a project or at the end of a life cycle of a project. So getting that education out to our management team, letting them understand, okay, risk is something that should come first when you're doing your planning. Don't plan to fail, but you should kind of plan to fail. See what the results are if this project does not succeed. What's the outcome? Okay, now we're looking at the outcome if this project fails. Okay, how are we going to mitigate this project from failing? Do that risk planning work up front versus doing it afterwards, because at that point it's too late. You're not going to get the benefit of going through that process of analyzing risk and being able to talk about it openly. Management does not want to be critical of their staff and saying, okay, this project is not going to succeed. No, it is going to succeed, because what we're going to do is put the work in up front, manage those risks to make sure we are taking an iterative approach and planning it to make sure that it's proper for this particular project. So again, having the discussion about risk, what does that mean? How does that translate into the day-to-day work that we're doing? And making sure that risk is not a taboo word that management does not want to talk about. Again, making them see the value up front versus seeing it afterwards, because at that point it's too late. And for me, that's what we've been doing, is making risk-based decision-making up front, and also looking at how well we're going to be able to mitigate that risk response plan, make sure it's appropriate for what we're doing. So from my standpoint at FERC, what we've been able to do successfully with our managers is just explaining to them what that risk-based approach means. Sometimes having those big words, it goes over individuals' heads, and they don't want to participate or don't want to put the work in up front. Showing them that value that you can achieve by putting that work in up front. So like I said, at FERC, it's been sometimes difficult with some managers because that's not how they manage certain processes. But we've been able to successfully implement, taking a look at risk before the project gets started.
Yeah, those are great observations. As you were saying that, the one thing that comes to mind for me there is that, you can have all the great infrastructure in the world and the structure in place and even resources dedicated, at least at the places that I've been at. But if you don't have risk culture and buy-in from the top, it's game over. You might as well fold up the tents and go somewhere else. So I'm glad to hear you saying your agency's putting the time and effort into making sure that that's there. I'm kind of mindful of the clock here with everybody, and I want to get this question in because I think it's probably a good one to kind of end this session on. And John, I'm going to come back to you on this. Do you have any examples of where ERM practices have kind of gone off the rails that we should try and avoid?
Sure. I think we've actually talked about a few of them. One of which is where risks that are reported are seen as essentially either a pass-through to an IG audit or a mechanism to have senior leaders come down and slap folks' wrists, that sort of thing. So that's number one. Number two, where I've seen it go off track, is if you just make it too complex. If you build so much into it that it's very difficult for anyone to really take part in. And that brings to number three, which is, even if it's not complex and it's not a pass-through, if you're not eventually providing value to the folks who are participating in it by helping them really understand risks and manage them, not just talk about them, but and manage them, which is, I think, in many ways, the intent of this entire session, is to think through how do we integrate risk management with other key management processes, other key stakeholders to deliver value, so that the risk information is really being used for value by senior leadership teams and by the organization. So that's kind of the third place where I see risk programs go off track, is if they're not regularly thinking about how to tailor and push information to provide real value.
Well, I don't know that we could have summed it up any better than those last comments there, John. So I think, again, in the interest of time, we're right almost at the top of the hour here. I'm going to leave it there, but I want to thank both of you today. Carrie, thank you so much for taking the time from FERC, and John, yourself, from all the things you guys are very busy, but appreciate you coming out and talking with us today about these important topics on risk management. And I'm sure I'll see some of you back here in the not too distant future for another session of our Risk Academy webinar. So thank you all again for participating.